Her husband didn't even look back. That's what broke her. Not the cold, not the pain tearing through her body with every labored breath, not the sound of her newborn son making that thin, papery cry that meant he was too weak to be loud anymore. It was the moment she realized Carl Voss had already decided, before he climbed up onto that wagon seat, before he said the words, before he even looked at her, that she was already dead weight in every sense of the phrase. "She'll slow us down," he told the wagon master, loud enough that Elena could hear every syllable from where she'd collapsed against the rear wheel. "We lose another hour in this storm, and we lose everyone." No one argued. That was the part that would stay with her longer than anything else. If this story hit you somewhere deep, stay with us. Drop your city or country in the comments right now, because I want to see exactly how far this story travels. Hit that like button if you believe no one deserves to be left behind, and subscribe so you don't miss what happens next. The mountain isn't done with any of them yet. The wagon train had been dying for 3 days before it finally decided to leave one of its own behind to finish the job. It hadn't started that way. When the Voss family joined the Alderman Company out of Fort Bridger in late October, there had been 41 people, 12 wagons, and the kind of cautious optimism that comes from having survived the flat plains and believing, wrongly, that the hardest part was behind them. The wagon master, a lean and perpetually squinting man named Douglas Alderman, had looked at Elena Voss during the initial muster with an expression he didn't bother hiding, the slow assessment of a man calculating weight versus value, finding the numbers disagreeable. Elena had been 8 months pregnant then. Heavily, visibly, unmistakably pregnant, with the kind of solid build that her mother had called sturdy and her husband's family had always called something less charitable. She had climbed onto her own wagon without help and met Alderman's gaze without flinching, and he had said nothing because Carl had already paid the fee and the company needed bodies that could work. So they took her. She had worked. Through the last gasping weeks of autumn, across frozen creek crossings and switchback trails that made the horses scream, Elena had cooked, mended, lifted, hauled, and done every task assigned to her without complaint. She had delivered her son, Thomas, in the back of a lurching wagon on a night when the temperature dropped so fast the water barrel cracked, with only the company's exhausted midwife and her 8-year-old daughter, Clara, present. The midwife had said afterward that she'd never seen a woman push that hard and make that little noise about it. Carl had stood outside the wagon during the birth. He told her later he hadn't wanted to be in the way. Thomas came into the world undersized and struggling, with a chest that worked too hard and a cry that never quite built to the full-throated wail that meant everything was fine. Elena had held him against her skin and refused to put him down. Even when her arms ached and her body needed sleep, it couldn't get. She had kept him warm through sheer will and body heat, and for 9 days it had seemed like that might be enough. Then the storm hit. It came down from the northern peaks without the usual warnings. No strange color in the sky, no unnatural stillness before the wind. It simply arrived, a wall of white that swallowed the trail and the trees and the horizon all at once. And Douglas Alderman had made exactly the wrong decision at exactly the wrong moment. He'd pushed them forward instead of making camp, convinced they were close enough to the lower pass that momentum would carry them through. By the time he admitted his mistake, 2 wagons had bogged down in drifts, and the temperature was falling fast enough that you could feel it happening in real time, like the air itself was slowly being drained of something essential. That was when Elena's body finally gave out. She hadn't felt it coming. Or maybe she had, and simply refused to acknowledge it, because acknowledgement would have meant stopping. But somewhere between helping push the Morrow family's stuck wagon free and hauling water to the horses, her legs simply stopped working the way they were supposed to. She went down against the rear wheel of her own wagon and stayed there. And what she felt most clearly in that first moment wasn't fear. It was the absolute bone-deep humiliation of being found on the ground. Clara found her first. The girl was 8 years old and already had the watchful eyes of a child who had learned that adults didn't always tell you when things were going wrong, so you had to watch for it yourself. She crouched down next to her mother in the snow and put her small hand against Elena's face and said, "Mama, you're really cold," with a steadiness that would have made Elena proud at any other moment. "I know, sweetheart," Elena said. "Get your father." Carl came. He knelt in the snow and looked at her, and she could see him doing the calculation behind his eyes, the same calculation Douglas Alderman had been doing for weeks, the one that reduced every human being to what they could carry and what they cost. Can you get up? He asked. Not right now. We can't stop, Elena. The whole company. I'm not asking you to stop the company, she said. Help me into the wagon. I just need an hour to rest and I'll be... She'll slow us down. He said it to Alderman, who had materialized at his shoulder the way men like Alderman always did when a decision needed to be made that someone else could be blamed for later. Carl said it like Elena wasn't there, like she was a problem being discussed rather than a person doing the listening. And Douglas Alderman looked at her in the snow and then looked at the storm closing in overhead and did the same math and arrived at the same answer. We lose another hour in this storm and we lose everyone, Alderman said. Carl nodded. He actually nodded. Carl. Elena's voice was quiet. That was the thing about her voice. It had always been quieter than people expected from a woman her size, and she had spent years wishing it were louder, more commanding, the kind of voice that filled a room and made people listen. Now she just used it. Carl, look at me. He looked at her. She would always wonder later what he saw. Whether he saw her, actually her, the woman he'd married, the mother of his children, or whether he just saw the problem. Whether there was a moment where it could have gone differently, where some other version of Carl Voss might have said no, absolutely not, help me get her into the wagon right now. Or whether the decision had already been made so thoroughly that looking at her changed nothing at all. Thomas, she said. Give me Thomas. Something moved across Carl's face. She couldn't name it. It wasn't guilt exactly. She didn't think Carl was built for guilt in the traditional sense. It was more like the expression of a man who had already closed a door and didn't want to look at what was on the other side. He's better off. Give me my son. There was a long moment. The wind had teeth. Elena could feel her fingers going numb where they pressed against the wheel spoke, and the back of her head was wet from the snow she'd been sitting in, and Thomas was in the wagon wrapped in every blanket they owned and crying that thin, papery cry. Carl got Thomas. He brought the baby to her bundled in wool and handed him down with the careful movements of a man who had not held his son very much in the 9 days since his birth, and Elena took the boy against her chest and felt the small bird-like flutter of his heartbeat against her ribs. We'll send back help, Carl said. Once we reach the station. Don't, Elena said. Elena, don't tell me that. Don't make it sound like something other than what it is. He stood up. She watched him do it. Watched him straighten to his full height in the snow, watched him turn toward the wagon, where Clara was sitting on the seat with her knees drawn up and her arms wrapped around herself. Clara looked back at her mother over her shoulder, and the expression on her daughter's face was something Elena would carry for the rest of her life. In the deep places where the worst things go, because Clara understood what was happening better than Elena had. And Clara's face showed it. Mama, Clara started. Stay with your father, Elena said. Her voice didn't break. She was proud of that later. Stay warm, sweetheart. You hear me? Stay warm and stay close to him. Carl lifted Clara back onto the wagon seat and picked up the reins. Douglas Alderman had already turned away, already moved on, already stopped seeing her. The company began to move slowly, the wagons grinding forward into the white, and Elena watched them go with her son pressed against her chest and her back against the wheel, and the cold coming in from everywhere at once. The last wagon passed her and didn't slow. She sat in the snow for what felt like a very long time. Thomas stirred against her chest, not crying anymore, just making small sounds, which was almost worse. She pulled the blankets tighter around him and thought, with a clarity that surprised her, that she needed to get out of the snow. Not because she believed she would survive, she had already run the numbers on that, the same way Alderman and Carl had, and the numbers said the same thing, but because she refused to be found sitting against a wagon wheel. If this was where it ended, she was going to find a tree or a rock or something solid to put her back against, somewhere she'd chosen herself. She got up. It cost her more than she expected. Her legs had gone past numb into something that felt mechanical, like operating someone else's limbs by remote, and she listed sideways badly before catching her balance. Thomas made a sound of protest at the sudden movement. I know, she told him. I know. I'm sorry. She found a stand of pines 30 yards off the trail, thick enough to break the worst of the wind, and made her way to them with the slow, deliberate movements of someone who understood that falling down again was not an option. She pressed her back against the widest trunk and slid down into the space between two roots that had grown above ground and formed a natural cradle, and she tucked Thomas inside her coat against her skin. and she wrapped the blankets around them both, and she waited. The storm got worse. She could feel it, the temperature dropping, the wind finding new angles, the darkness coming earlier than it should have. She couldn't see more than 10 feet in any direction. The pines swayed overhead and made sounds she didn't try to identify. Thomas had gone very quiet against her chest, and she kept one hand pressed flat against his back just to feel him breathing. She was very tired. She had been tired for 9 days, tired in the way that goes all the way through a person and becomes a kind of architecture. The tiredness was structural now, load-bearing, and without it she wasn't sure what would be holding her up. She let her eyes close for a moment. Just a moment. She told herself it was just to rest them, not to sleep, not to give in to the particular cold that had started somewhere in her center and was working outward methodically, like a man going through drawers. She heard the horses before she saw anything, not the company's horses. Those sounds had faded long ago, swallowed by the storm. These were different, heavier, and there was the creak of a heavily loaded wagon and the specific sound of a man who knew how to move through weather, which is to say, not quietly but purposefully, each movement costing only what it had to cost and nothing more. Elena opened her eyes. The wagon came out of the white like something her mind had manufactured, wide and dark, and loaded high with pelts and crates, pulled by a pair of enormous draft horses that were moving with their heads down and their ears back in the way of animals who had decided the weather was an insult they had chosen to ignore. On the seat was a man who was hard to see at first, because he was dressed so completely in the colors of the mountain that he seemed to be part of it. He was big. She registered that first, not in the way Carl had been big, with the soft bulk of a man who ate well and worked selectively, but in the way of something structural, like the pines she'd pressed herself against. He wore a heavy coat that had seen years of hard use, and his face, when she could make it out through the snow, was weathered in a way that made it difficult to assign an age. He had a beard that had grown past the point of grooming into something more like a feature of the landscape. He was not looking in her direction. His attention was on the trail ahead, on the horses, on the business of moving through the storm. He would pass within 20 yards of where she sat and never know she was there. Elena looked down at Thomas. His lips had gone pale. Not blue, not yet, but the particular pale that lives just before blue, the color that every mother learns to fear without being taught. She opened her mouth. What came out wasn't a scream. She wasn't capable of a scream anymore, not with her throat stripped raw from the cold and her body running on some reserve that had almost nothing left in it. What came out was more like a sound, a rough, torn thing that might have been a word or might have just been air-forced out by desperation. But it was enough. The man on the wagon seat turned his head. He saw her. She could tell by the way he went completely still. Not the stillness of surprise, but the stillness of a man who was taking in information before deciding what to do with it. His horses felt the change in his attention and slowed without being asked. He pulled up. The wagon stopped. He sat there for a moment that felt much longer than it was, looking at her. Then he wrapped the reins around the brake handle and climbed down from the seat, with movements that were unhurried but not slow, if that distinction makes any sense. The movements of a man who didn't waste motion, but also didn't allow urgency to make him careless. He walked to where she sat between the pine roots and crouched down in front of her, and she got her first clear look at his face. His eyes were gray-green, the color of lichen on rock, and they moved over her with the same methodical attention he had used on the trail, assessing, calibrating, not unfriendly, but not warm either. The eyes of a man who made decisions based on what was actually in front of him. He looked at Thomas. Something changed in his expression. Not much, just a small tightening around the eyes, the way a person looks when they see a thing they know requires action. "How long have you been out here?" he asked. His voice was low and unhurried, like the man himself. "I don't know," Elena said. "A while." "The baby breathing?" "Yes." "His color—" She stopped. "His lips aren't right." The man reached out and pressed 2 fingers very gently against Thomas's neck, just below the ear, and held them there for a few seconds. His hands were enormous and chapped red from the cold, but they moved with a precision that didn't match their size. "He's cold," the man said, "but he's got a pulse." "I know he's cold," Elena said, and she heard the exhaustion in her own voice, the way it flattened the words out. "What do I do?" He looked at her for a moment. First you get off the ground, he said. Then we worry about the rest of it. I can get up on my own, she said, which was almost certainly not true. I didn't say you couldn't, he said, and stood back to give her room to try. She tried. She got as far as getting her feet under her before her legs made it very clear that they had been accommodating her all this time and were finished with the arrangement. She started to go down, and his hands were already there, not grabbing, not yanking, just steady, 2 points of contact that let her find her balance without doing it for her. Thank you, she said. He didn't say you're welcome. He said, Can you walk to the wagon? Yes. All right, go slow. She went slow. He walked beside her without touching her again unless she needed it, and she needed it twice, once when her right leg buckled on a hidden root, and once when the wind hit at an angle that would have knocked her sideways. Each time he was there without comment, and each time he stepped back when she steadied. At the wagon, he helped her up onto the seat, and then climbed up beside her and pulled a heavy blanket from the box behind the seat and put it around her shoulders without asking, and she didn't argue because she was past the point where pride was a useful thing to carry. He took the reins. The horses felt him settle and started moving without being told, which told her something about how long he'd had them. Who are you? She asked. Gideon Rourke, he said. She waited to see if he'd ask her the same question. He didn't. He was watching the trail. Elena Voss, she said anyway. This is Thomas. He's 9 days old. Gideon Rourke said nothing for a moment. Then he said, The wagon train that came through here, that was yours? Yes. Another pause. They left you. It wasn't a question. He'd already worked it out. The way she was alone, the way she was where she was, the way no one had come back. He wasn't asking for confirmation. He was just saying it the way you say a fact about weather. Yes, Elena said. He nodded once, the single nod of a man filing information, and turned his attention back to the horses. Elena looked at his profile, the set of his jaw. The way the cold didn't seem to bother him the way it bothered everyone else. The fact that he had stopped at all when he could have gone straight past without ever turning his head. And felt something she couldn't name. Not gratitude exactly, though that was part of it. Something more like the strange relief of being seen by someone who wasn't going to make a calculation about your worth before deciding what you deserved. Thomas stirred against her chest. She put her hand on his back and felt him breathe, small and determined, and pressed him closer. The wagon moved into the white. After a while she said, Where are we going? My cabin, Gideon said. 2 hours in good weather. Maybe 3 in this. Do you... She stopped, started again. Do you have supplies? For a baby? I have some in my pack, but not... I have what I have, he said. We'll see what's enough. It wasn't reassuring. It was honest, which was better. I don't expect you to take care of us, she said. I want you to know that. I can work. Whatever you need done, I can work. He glanced at her sideways, just a brief look, assessing. All right, he said. I mean it. I heard you, he said. Not unkind, just final. She watched the trees move past in the white and thought about Clara sitting on the wagon seat with her knees pulled up. She thought about the look on her daughter's face when Carl had lifted her back up and picked up the reins. She thought about Carl's nod, the actual nod, the way he had accepted the verdict with that small, economical movement, as though the decision were someone else's, and he was simply agreeing to it. She didn't cry. She was too cold to cry, and too tired to cry, and she had Thomas against her chest, and a stranger beside her who had stopped his wagon in a blizzard for no reason that made practical sense, and she thought that crying could wait. There would probably be enough time for it later. There was always enough time for the things that hurt. Thomas made a sound, small, searching, the sound he made when he was hungry. He needs to eat soon, she said. Can you? She thought about it. Yes, if I can get warm enough. The cabin has a fire, Gideon said. We'll get there. The certainty in his voice was remarkable. Not the false certainty of a man telling you what you wanted to hear, but the flat certainty of someone who had been making his way through mountains long enough to know what was possible and what wasn't, and had already determined this was in the first category. Elena held on to that certainty like a handhold on a cliff face, something solid to press her weight against. The storm howled. The horses kept moving. An hour into the drive, the trail narrowed and steepened, and Gideon went quiet in the way of someone who needed all of his attention for what he was doing. Elena watched his hands on the reins, the way he felt the horses through the leather, the constant small adjustments, the occasional word spoken low under his breath that wasn't quite language but that the horses responded to. She had driven wagons. She knew enough to recognize skill when she saw it. Thomas had gone quiet. Not the worrying quiet of before, more the quiet of something small and exhausted that had decided rest was available and was taking it. She could feel him breathing in the slow rhythm of sleep, and she let herself breathe with him. The company, Gideon said after a while. Where were they headed? Farrow's Creek Station, then west to the Valley settlements. He was quiet for a moment. They won't make it to Farrow's Creek in this. Elena looked at him. What? Pass they'd have to cross. It closed 2 days ago. I came through ahead of it. He said it without particular inflection, just information. They'll hole up somewhere, wait it out. The information landed strangely. She had spent the last hour trying not to think about Clara, about whether she was warm, whether Carl had enough sense to make camp instead of pushing forward, whether Alderman's certainty would get them all killed. Knowing they were stopped, waiting, not advancing into the storm without her. It didn't fix anything, but it loosened something in her chest. They might send someone back, she said. Not because she believed it. Gideon didn't answer, which was its own answer. Clara, Elena said. It was the first time she'd said her daughter's name out loud since the wagon pulled away, and saying it was harder than she'd expected. My daughter, she's 8. Gideon turned his head briefly. She'll be all right, he said. If they camp, she'll be all right. You don't know that. No, he said, but she's got a better chance camped in the storm than you had sitting in the snow, and you're still here. It was a strange thing to say. Elena turned it over in her mind and found it was something she needed to hear, not because it was comforting, but because it was true in the unsentimental way that true things often were. The kind of truth that didn't ask you to feel better, just to keep going. She kept going. The temperature continued to drop. She stopped being able to feel her feet around the second hour, which she reported to Gideon without drama, and he reached back into the wagon box without taking his eyes off the trail and produced a second blanket and told her to wrap her feet. She wrapped her feet. It helped some. Thomas slept on, indifferent to the crisis of his own survival, and Elena found that indifference oddly comforting, the way babies trusted the world to handle it. Not because they were naive, but because they didn't have the cognitive machinery yet to do anything else. She had spent 9 days worrying enough for both of them. She could probably afford to stop for an hour. The third hour was the worst. The trail had become something Gideon was inventing as much as following, picking his way through snow that had buried the established path and finding the underneath logic of the terrain, where the slope said a trail would be, where the gaps in the trees made passage possible. He spoke to the horses almost constantly now, low and even, and they responded with the kind of trust that takes years to build. Elena sat up straight and watched and tried to be useful in the way she'd learned to be useful, not by acting, but by not adding to the problem. She didn't ask questions. She didn't make sounds. She tracked what Gideon was tracking and kept Thomas warm and didn't shift her weight, except when she had to. Once, when the left horse stumbled on hidden ice and the wagon lurched sideways, she grabbed the seat rail with her free hand and held them both steady without being asked. Gideon righted the horses, got them back on course, and glanced at her. He didn't say anything. But something in his expression changed, microscopically, the way a thing shifts when you've made a calculation, and the answer comes out differently than you expected. They came through a stand of old growth pines, and Elena saw the cabin. It was not what she would have imagined if she'd been imagining. It was bigger than she'd expected, solid, with the kind of square-shouldered construction that meant someone had built it to last, rather than to be impressive, with a stone chimney and a covered porch and a woodpile stacked 6 feet high against the south wall. It sat in a natural hollow that broke the worst of the wind, and the snow around it was packed and tracked in the patterns of a place that was regularly used. Home, Gideon said, and not with sentiment, just identification. He drove the wagon around to the side out of the direct wind and set the brake. Then he turned to her. Can you get down? He asked. Yes, she said. This time it was true. She climbed down from the wagon seat with Thomas braced against her chest and her legs held. They were clumsy and half numb, and she had to think about each step, but they held. Gideon came around and took her elbow, not grabbing, just there, and guided her toward the cabin door. Inside was dark and cold, but not as cold as outside, which was enough. Gideon moved past her to the fireplace and had a fire going in what seemed like no time at all, with the efficiency of a man who had started fires in cold cabins so many times that his body knew the sequence before his mind did. The light came up. The cold started to loosen. Elena lowered herself into the chair nearest the fire and opened her coat and looked at Thomas. He looked up at her with the unfocused gaze of a newborn who had been cold and was slowly realizing he was less cold, and his color, she checked his lips first, then his hands, was better. Pale still, but the kind of pale that was just his nature, not the pale that preceded blue. She let out a breath that felt like it had been waiting in her body for hours. "There's a cot in the back," Gideon said from somewhere behind her. He was moving around the cabin, doing things. She could hear him, but she didn't turn to look. "Blankets in the chest. You can take the cot tonight." "What about you?" "I don't need it." She started to argue and stopped herself. There would be time for that. First Thomas needed to eat, and then she needed to sleep, and then she would deal with the rest of it. She looked around the cabin, the careful order of it, the way everything had its place and its purpose, the total absence of things that were there for decoration rather than use. A man's space built entirely around function, with no accommodation made for the presence of anyone else. And yet he had brought them here. She didn't understand it yet. Maybe she didn't need to. Outside the cabin walls, the storm went on building itself into something historic, burying the trail back and forward and sideways, sealing them in. And Elena Voss sat next to the fire with her son against her chest, and was, against all reasonable expectation, alive. She thought about the nod, Carl's nod. She thought about Clara's face. She pressed Thomas closer and watched the fire and did not cry. And outside the mountain rose indifferent and enormous into the dark, and Gideon Rourke moved quietly around the edges of the room doing what needed doing, which was the only way he had ever known how to be. The fire had burned down to coals by the time Thomas finally slept without being held. Elena didn't move for a long time after that. She sat in the chair with her hands in her lap and watched the orange pulse of the embers and listened to the storm doing what storms do when they've decided to be serious about it. Not howling, exactly, but pressing. A sustained low roar that made the cabin walls feel thin, even though they clearly weren't. The logs Gideon had used were old growth, fitted tight, the kind of construction that didn't apologize for itself. She could feel the wind trying to find a way in and failing. Thomas was in the cot Gideon had set up near the fire, wrapped in blankets that smelled like pine resin and wood smoke, and the particular cleanness of things stored in a dry place for a long time. His color was better. His breathing had evened out. She had fed him twice in the night, and both times he had eaten with the focused urgency of a creature that had decided, at some cellular level, to stay. She didn't know when Gideon had slept. She wasn't sure he had. When the gray light started coming through the single window above the table, she found him outside. She heard him before she saw him. The sound of an axe hitting wood with the metronomic regularity of someone who had done it so many times that the rhythm was unconscious. She wrapped a blanket around her shoulders and opened the cabin door and stood on the porch. He was at the woodpile, working through a section of timber that hadn't been split yet, and he was doing it with the unhurried efficiency she was beginning to understand was just his natural mode of being. He swung, the wood split, he set the next piece, he swung again. His breath made clouds in the cold air. He hadn't looked up when the door opened. "You were up all night," she said. "I sleep light in storms," he said, still not looking up. "How's the baby?" "Better." His color came back. He nodded and split another piece. "Good." She stood on the porch for a moment, watching. "Did you eat?" "Not yet." "I'll make something," she said, "if you tell me where things are." He stopped and looked at her then, just briefly, the same assessing look he'd given her on the wagon seat when she'd told him she could work. He was deciding whether to argue, she thought. Then he apparently decided not to. "Supplies are in the crate against the left wall. Oats, dried meat, some flour. Salt's on the shelf above the fire." "All right," she said. She went back inside and found what he'd described and made a meal with it. Nothing elaborate, a simple porridge with the dried meat cut small and worked in, the kind of thing that was about function rather than pleasure, but would stay with a person for hours. She had cooked this way for years, making do with what there was, and her hands remembered the sequence without being asked. Thomas woke up while she was cooking, and she went to him, changed him with the rags she'd thought to rinse the night before, and got him settled again. He looked at her with the wide, uncomprehending gaze of a newborn, blinking against the firelight, and she thought he looked more solid than he had yesterday, more present, like something in him had made a decision. "I know," she told him quietly. "Me too." Gideon came in while the food was still hot. He stopped just inside the door and looked at the pot on the fire, and then at her, and something crossed his face that she couldn't read. "You didn't have to do that," he said. "I said I could work," Elena said. "Sit down." He sat down. She served him and then served herself, and they ate at the table across from each other in the particular silence of two people who were still figuring out the geometry of shared space. He ate without comment, which she took as a good sign, because men who didn't like food didn't usually stay quiet about it. Halfway through the bowl, he said, "The storm's going to last at least 2 more days, maybe 3. All right. The pass will be buried after that." She set down her spoon. "How buried?" "Deep enough that nobody's coming over it until late spring." He said it straight, no softening. "This time of year, once it closes, it stays closed." Elena looked at the window. The light coming through was the flat, directionless white of heavy cloud cover, and the sound of the wind hadn't changed. She thought about the wagon train camped somewhere on the other side of the mountain. She thought about Clara in whatever shelter Carl had managed to put together. She thought about the station at Farrow's Creek and the valley settlements beyond it, and the life that had been, until 3 days ago, the life she was supposed to be living. "So we're here until spring," she said, "unless you want to try moving before the pass clears, which I'd advise against." "I'm not stupid," she said, and it came out sharper than she intended. He looked at her. "I didn't say you were." She picked up her spoon again. "No," she said. "You didn't. I'm sorry." He went back to eating. The fire popped. Thomas made a small sound from the cot and settled back into sleep. "My daughter is on the other side of that pass," Elena said. She wasn't asking for anything. She just needed to say it out loud to someone who would hear it as a fact rather than a problem to be managed. "She's 8 years old, and she's on the other side of that mountain, and I can't get to her until spring." Gideon set down his spoon. He didn't offer platitudes. He didn't tell her Clara would be fine, or that Carl would take care of her, or that spring would come quickly. He just sat there and let the fact be what it was, and after a moment he said, "Is her father capable?" "He's capable," Elena said. "He's capable, and he's careful, and he doesn't take unnecessary risks." She paused. "He just doesn't—" She stopped again. "Doesn't what?" "He doesn't have much extra," she said finally, "for things that aren't immediately practical." Gideon considered this. "She'll survive," he said. "That kind of man. Capable. Careful. She'll be fed and sheltered. She'll survive." "Surviving isn't the same thing as being all right." "Right." "No," he agreed. "It's not." The honesty of it hit her differently than comfort would have. She had spent so many years being offered comfort that turned out to be scaffolding, something erected quickly over a problem to make it less visible, not to fix it. Gideon Rourke apparently had no scaffolding to offer, which meant what he gave her was just the thing itself, and the thing itself was somehow easier to hold. The second day was harder in different ways. Thomas's improvement the first night didn't continue in a straight line. Nothing ever did. She'd learned that much. He slept fitfully, ate erratically, and by the afternoon of the second day had developed a congestion in his chest that she could hear when she pressed her ear against his back. Not rattling, not the deep, wet sound that meant real trouble, but present. "There, an announcement of potential difficulty," she told Gideon. He was quiet for a moment, then went to a shelf on the far wall and came back with a small tin. He opened it and held it out. Inside was a dark, thick substance that smelled of pine and something else she couldn't identify, something medicinal, something that had probably been learned from someone who'd learned it from someone before them. "What is it?" she asked. "Salve for the chest. You rub it on, keep him close to the heat." He paused. "My mother made it, years back. I kept the recipe." She looked at him. It was the first personal thing he'd said since she'd arrived. She didn't make a thing of it, just took the tin and said, "Thank you," and went to Thomas. She rubbed the salve carefully across his small chest and wrapped him back up and held him close to the fire, and she sang to him because he was fussy and nothing else was settling him. She didn't sing loudly. She wasn't sure she had ever sung loudly in her life. Her voice was the same as her speaking voice, quieter than expected, and it worked low and close to the ear. She sang the songs her mother had sung to her, the ones she'd been sure she'd forgotten until her own children made her need them again. She became aware after a while that Gideon had stopped moving. He was at the table with a harness he'd been repairing, and he had gone still over it. Not obviously. He wasn't watching her with any kind of visible attention. But the harness wasn't moving, and his hands weren't moving, and the cabin had the quality of a space in which someone was listening carefully. She stopped singing. "Don't stop on my account," he said, not looking up. She felt heat come into her face, which surprised her. She hadn't thought she had enough warmth left in her body for embarrassment. "I didn't know you could hear." "It's a small cabin." She looked at Thomas, who had gone drowsy and compliant against her shoulder, eyelids drooping. She kept going, quieter than before, and after a moment she heard the harness start moving again, and neither of them said anything about it. By the third day, the storm had settled into something she could almost take for granted. Still present, still loud, but no longer actively threatening. The cold outside was serious business, but inside the cabin the fire kept a serviceable temperature as long as it was fed, and feeding it had become part of her daily structure, along with the cooking and the cleaning and the constant management of Thomas's needs. She had expected Gideon to be irritable in the confines of enforced proximity. Men who lived alone, in her experience, guarded their solitude the way other men guarded money, with a specific anxiety that came from knowing what it felt like to have enough and then have it taken. She had braced for the friction of it, the invisible resentments that would build and need to be navigated. What she hadn't expected was that he would simply be who he was, without apparent adjustment. He didn't change his rhythms to accommodate her and didn't expect her to change hers. He was up early and outside working and back in for meals and back to whatever needed doing in the cabin in the afternoon. He didn't fill silence with noise for its own sake, which she appreciated more than she could have explained. She had lived most of her adult life in small spaces with people who used conversation to avoid thinking, and the habit of it had worn on her more than she'd ever admitted. With Gideon, the silences were just silences. They didn't require filling. What did require filling was Thomas's increasingly urgent need for warmth and consistency, and the kind of focused care that left no extra margin. On the fourth day, his chest congestion worsened, and Elena ran the numbers on what she had. The salve, the fire, her own body heat, the dried chamomile she'd found in her pack that she brewed into weak tea. She could take herself to pass some of it on. She didn't panic. She had gone past the point where panic was available to her. She just worked through what she had and came up short, and went to Gideon. "He's not worse," she said, "but he's not better." Gideon put down what he was working on and came to look. He put those careful hands on Thomas, on his chest, feeling the quality of his breathing, pressing gently along his ribs, with the attention of someone who had dealt with sick animals and understood that breathing told you most of what you needed to know. "He's working harder than he should be," Gideon said. "Yes." "Has he eaten?" "Yes, that part's okay." Gideon was quiet for a moment. Then he went to the shelf again and came back with a small ceramic jar that had been sealed with wax. He broke the seal carefully, and the smell that came out was sharp and clean. Eucalyptus, she thought, or something like it. "Steam," he said. "Heat some water until it's steaming, add this, and hold him over it with a cloth over both your heads. 10 minutes. Do it 3 times today." She looked at him. "Where did you get, traitor? 2 summers back. I keep things." He said it without elaboration, the way he said most things. She did it. 3 times, the awkward bent-over position with Thomas wrapped in the cloth tent above the steaming pot, both of them breathing the sharp, clean air. And by evening, Thomas's chest had loosened perceptibly. His breathing was easier. He ate with more focus. He slept the quiet sleep she'd been trying to get him to sleep for 4 days. She sat on the floor next to the cot after he went down and put her head against the side of it, and closed her eyes and felt something release in her chest that had been clenched since the moment she'd heard the congestion. "Thank you," she said. To the room, really. She wasn't even sure Gideon was close enough to hear. "For the jar, for all of it." "He's a tough kid," Gideon said. He was across the room, and his voice was low, but the cabin carried it. "He's been fighting since he got here." "He has," she said. She stayed on the floor for a while, too tired to move to the chair, and thought about the fact that her son was 9. No, 13 days old, and had already been left to die in a snowstorm, and was currently sleeping peacefully in the cabin of a man who hadn't known either of them existed 2 weeks ago. Life was genuinely strange in ways that no one could have prepared her for. "Gideon," she said. Why did you stop?" "On the trail. You could have gone straight past." There was a pause. The fire made its sounds. Outside, the wind pushed at the walls. "I saw you," he said. "A lot of people saw me. The whole wagon train saw me." "I mean, I saw you get up," he said, "after they left. I was higher on the trail. I saw the company moving, and I saw something that didn't move with them. I was going to keep going." A pause. "Then you got up and started walking, and I thought, no one does that unless they've got something to go toward." She turned this over. "I didn't have anywhere to go." "I know," he said, "but you didn't know that yet." She looked up at the ceiling. The logs were dark with age and smoke, the ceiling of a place that had absorbed years of winters. "That's a strange reason to stop for someone," she said. "It's the only reason I had," he said. "It was enough." She didn't answer. After a while she heard him move, to the far end of the cabin where he had his bedroll, she thought, and she stayed on the floor until the cold from the boards came up through the blanket she was sitting on, and then she got up and went to her cot and slept. The food situation became a serious problem by the end of the first week. Not an emergency. Gideon had supplies, and he knew how to stretch them, but he had stocked for one person through a winter that was now clearly going to run longer and harder than usual. And 2 adults and an infant who needed a nursing mother's caloric intake changed the math considerably. He laid it out for her without drama on the 7th morning, the inventory he'd done in his head, what they had, what they'd burned through at this rate, where the gap opened up. "We're all right for a month," he said. "After that it gets thinner." "Can you hunt?" "In this weather, yes. Not far, and not reliably." He looked at the window. "There are traps on the northwest slope. I put them out in October. I've been letting them sit." "Can you check them?" "I was planning to tomorrow if the wind drops." "I can come with you." He looked at her. "You've got the baby." "I know. Can he—" She thought about it. "Is there a way to carry him that keeps him warm enough? I've seen women carry infants in front, under the coat. He's got good color now. He's been eating—" "Elena." His voice wasn't unkind. "You're 2 weeks out from having him, in a snowstorm." "I know when I had him," she said. "I also know what I can do." He studied her. She met his eyes and didn't look away, because she had learned in the past week that Gideon Rourke responded to directness the way a compass responded to north. You got his full attention and a straight answer. "The traps aren't far," he said finally, "if the weather holds. If you feel it going wrong at any point, you tell me immediately and we come back." "Agreed," she said. "And you carry the baby my way, not your way. I've got a rig that works." She blinked. "You have a rig for carrying infants." "I have a rig for carrying things close to the body in cold weather," he said, with the slight adjustment of a man who did not want to be caught, having specifically anticipated this situation. "It works for a baby." She found that she almost smiled. "All right," she said, "your way." The rig turned out to be a length of woven wool strap, and a second piece that formed a cradle when tied correctly, and it took him 3 tries and 1 burst of low-voiced profanity to get it configured to his apparent satisfaction. Elena stood still while he worked the knot at her back and didn't comment on how long it took or the profanity, and when he stepped back and said, "Try that," she did, and Thomas was warm against her chest with both her hands free, which was better than she'd managed on her own. "Where did you learn to do that?" she asked. "Fur trader I traveled with when I was young," he said. "He had a wife who did it with their kids. I paid attention." "You pay attention to everything," she said. He picked up his coat. "Not everything," he said. "Just the things that matter." They went out the next morning when the wind had dropped to manageable. The traps were set in a pattern she never would have found on her own. The logic of them was in the terrain, placed where animals moved based on reasons that required knowledge she didn't have. Gideon moved through the snow with the efficiency of someone who had walked this mountain in every condition it could produce, and Elena followed in his tracks and concentrated on keeping her footing. 2 of the 6 traps had something in them. Not much, a large rabbit and what Gideon identified as a pine marten, but enough to matter. He reset both traps with movements so practiced they were almost automatic, and they started back. Halfway back, the wind came back. It didn't come back gently. It came back the way weather came back at altitude, without warning or apology, going from manageable to serious in the span of about 3 minutes. Elena felt it hit her back and staggered forward into Gideon's tracks, and recovered. How far? She asked. 20 minutes, he said. He had turned around and was looking at the sky with the expression of a man recalculating. Maybe 15 if we move. Move then, she said. They moved. She didn't ask him to slow down, and he didn't tell her to keep up. They just moved, the same pace, her breath making ragged clouds in the wind, Thomas pressed against her chest under her coat, the cold finding every gap in her clothing with the focused malice of something personal. She stumbled once on a buried root. Gideon's hand was on her arm before she'd registered the stumble, steadying her, and then it was gone. On, not hovering, not making a thing of it. Just there, and then not. They made the cabin in 12 minutes. Inside, she went straight to the fire, and Gideon checked Thomas before she'd even gotten her coat off, crouched down and pressed his fingers to the baby's neck, and checked his face, and then sat back and said, "He's fine. Cold, but fine." Elena sat down on the floor in front of the fire and let the heat come back into her face. "I lost my footing back there," she said. "I shouldn't have—" "You kept it," he said. "That's what matters." "I almost isn't the same as did," he said. He was hanging his own coat. "You've never walked on mountain snow before. You stumbled once and recovered. That's not a failure." She looked at him. He wasn't saying it to make her feel better. She had enough experience of being comforted to recognize the difference. He was saying it because he meant it, because in his accounting that was the accurate reading of what had happened. "I'm going to get better at it," she said. "I know," he said, and went to deal with the day's catch. She sat by the fire and held Thomas and thought about the word better. How she'd spent so many years hearing what she was wrong about. Too big, too slow, too much in every direction that inconvenienced someone. And how she'd absorbed it the way you absorb things you hear often enough. Not because you believe them exactly, but because repetition has its own gravity. And here was this man who had watched her walk 2 miles through mountain snow 2 weeks after childbirth, stumble once, recover, and keep going, and said, "I know," with the flat certainty of someone who wasn't predicting, just observing. She pressed her face against the top of Thomas's head. Outside, the storm went on, filling in the tracks they'd made, erasing the evidence of their walk back and back and back again. The mountain held them in its winter grip and didn't particularly care what they felt about it, and inside the cabin the fire burned and the meat from the day's traps began to smell like something worth eating, and Thomas slept with his fist closed against Elena's collarbone, like he was holding on to something he intended to keep. Gideon worked quietly at the far end of the cabin, and Elena listened to the sounds of him and thought about the word enough. What Gideon had said that first night about why he'd stopped on the trail. It was the only reason I had. It was enough. She was beginning to think that was how he lived, not with excess, not with elaborate justifications, but with what was enough. Enough fire, enough food, enough reason. Enough honesty to say a hard thing instead of a comfortable one, and enough silence to let the hard thing sit without smothering it. She didn't know what to do with him yet. She didn't know what came after this, after the winter, after the past cleared and the world on the other side became accessible again. Clara was there, on the other side, and the thought of her daughter was a constant low ache she'd learned to carry the way you carried an injury that wasn't going to heal quickly, carefully, deliberately, without letting it make all your decisions for you. But right now there was the fire, and Thomas breathing, and the smell of meat cooking, and the sound of Gideon moving around the edges of the space they were somehow, against all probability, sharing. She didn't think about tomorrow. She thought about the day, and what the day had held, and the fact that it had held enough. 3 weeks into the winter, Elena stopped counting days. It wasn't defeat. It was something closer to practicality. The days didn't have names up here, not in any way that mattered. They had temperatures and weather and what needed doing, and those things ordered themselves into a rhythm that was more reliable than any calendar she'd kept before. She knew it was morning when Gideon was already up, and the fire had been fed. She knew it was afternoon when the light through the west-facing window went yellow and long. She knew it was time to sleep when Thomas had been fed and settled, and there was nothing left that couldn't wait until the morning version of this same day arrived. The rhythm held her when other things didn't. Thomas was growing. She could feel it in the way he'd gotten heavier in her arms. Not dramatically, not the way she'd read about in the almanac entries that described infant development as though children were crops following a predictable schedule, but genuinely, perceptibly heavier. His eyes tracked things now. Her face, mostly. The fire. Once, with what seemed like great philosophical seriousness, a knot in the ceiling beam above his cot. He's watching that spot every morning, she told Gideon one day, gesturing up at the beam. Gideon looked up from the harness he was treating with oil, looked at the beam, looked at Thomas, who was indeed staring upward with the fixed attention of someone receiving important information. Knot does look like a face, Gideon said, and went back to the harness. She laughed before she could help it. Not a polite laugh, an actual one, short and surprised, the kind that catches in your throat on the way out because you weren't expecting it. Gideon didn't look up, but something around his mouth changed. She hadn't laughed since before the storm. She hadn't realized that until it happened. The days kept coming, the snow kept falling, and Elena kept learning the mountain the way you learn a language when you have no choice. Not through study, but through immersion, through making enough small mistakes that the corrections became instinct. She learned which wood burned longest versus which caught fastest, and that the difference mattered depending on whether you needed a fire started quickly or sustained through a long, cold night. She learned how to pack snow at the door to insulate the gap at the bottom of the frame, and what it sounded like when the wind was coming from the north as opposed to the west, and why that distinction meant different things for the horses. She learned that the horses, two enormous Belgians that Gideon called Bram and Dutch, neither name apparently having a story behind it that he was willing to share, had precise social opinions about each other and about humans, and that Dutch, specifically, did not want to be approached from the left side on cold mornings, and would communicate this preference physically if you forgot. She forgot once. She didn't forget again. "You should have warned me," she said to Gideon afterward, pressing the heel of her hand against her shoulder where Dutch's nose had connected. "I did warn you," he said. "I said he was particular." Particular is a word for a man who arranges his forks a specific way. That horse has genuine grievances. "He does," Gideon agreed, and the corner of his mouth moved. "He's had them for years. I've stopped trying to reason with him about it." She found herself watching Gideon the way she watched the weather. Not obsessively, not with anxiety, but with the practical attention of someone who understood that the information was useful. He was not a man who explained to himself. He didn't announce what he was doing or why, didn't narrate his reasoning or offer context for his decisions. He simply did things, and the things were usually right, and if you wanted to understand why, you had to watch and put it together yourself. What she put together, over weeks, was this. He was meticulous about anything that could prevent a larger problem. The traps, the horses, the firewood stacked specifically for how it would dry, the food stores rotated so nothing was left to go bad at the back of a shelf. He was not meticulous about himself. He ate whatever was available without preference, slept when he could, in whatever position was practical, wore the same clothes until they needed mending, and then mended them with the functional stitches of someone who didn't care what it looked like, only whether it would hold. He was also, she discovered, a person who read. She found this out by accident when she moved a crate to get at the flower behind it, and found underneath a collection of books wrapped carefully in oilskin, perhaps a dozen of them, well used, spines soft with handling. She stood there with the crate in her hands and looked at them. "You can read those if you want," Gideon said from behind her. "They're not doing anything under there." "I didn't know you had them. You didn't ask." She picked one up and turned it over. Natural history, observations from a surveyor who'd traveled the Northern Territories 20 years back. She looked at the next one. A history of surveying techniques, heavily annotated in the margins in small, precise handwriting. She looked at the handwriting more closely. "These are your notes," she said. She opened the surveying book to a marked page. The margin notes were dense, sometimes agreeing with the author, sometimes clearly not. One entry simply reading wrong about the soil composition. "Checked this myself, spring 1869, and underlined twice." "You checked it yourself," she said. "He was wrong." She put the book back carefully. "What else are you wrong about that you know you're wrong about?" He considered the question with the seriousness it probably didn't require. "Not much," he said. "That's usually how it works." She took the natural history book to read by the fire in the evenings, and found that it was actually absorbing. The writer had a dry humor and a genuine curiosity that made the taxonomy of mountain flora and fauna feel like something other than a list. She read passages aloud sometimes, when Thomas was settled and she had enough energy for it. She wasn't sure if Gideon was listening. Then once, when she read a passage about beavers that the author had gotten demonstrably wrong based on what she'd observed even in her limited time here, Gideon said he never actually saw one from across the room without looking up. So he was listening. The crisis, when it came, didn't announce itself. That was the thing about the mountain. It didn't give you the courtesy of a warning you could prepare for. One thing was fine, and then another thing wasn't, and the gap between those two states was just the time it took for conditions to change, which up here could be very fast indeed. It was the 5th week. Gideon had gone to check the far traps, the ones on the northwest slope that were a harder walk and that he'd been putting off because the weather hadn't given him a good window. The window came. 2 days of clear, cold, hard blue sky, the mountain stripped of its wind, if not its temperature. And he went early and told her he'd be back before midday. He wasn't back before midday. Elena didn't start worrying right away, because she'd learned that his time estimates were accurate in good conditions, and good conditions could change. She kept to her tasks, fed Thomas, started a pot of beans soaking, checked the horses, brought in wood from the stack. She watched the sky. The blue held. Midday became early afternoon. Early afternoon became the slow shift toward the afternoon light that meant 2 hours to dark. She fed Thomas and put him in the cot and pulled on her coat and went to the door and stood on the porch and looked up the slope. Nothing. Just the white and the pines and the particular silence that the mountain made when the wind stopped. She went back inside and put more wood on the fire and thought about her options with the focused clarity of someone running numbers. She didn't know the northwest slope. She knew the trap line from having walked it with Gideon twice, but the far traps were beyond where she'd been, and going out in unfamiliar terrain in the afternoon with a nursing infant and getting disoriented in the dark was not a solution to any problem. She could stay. She could wait. She stayed. She waited. It was nearly dark when she heard the horses. Not the cabin horses. Different horses, one of them, moving in the particular tentative way of a horse picking through uncertain footing in low light. She was at the door before the sound fully registered and out on the porch with her coat half on. Gideon came out of the tree line on horseback. He'd taken Dutch out, which she hadn't realized, and Dutch was moving wrong, head high and legs picking up and putting down with excessive care. Then she saw Gideon's posture and understood why. He was sitting forward in a way that wasn't natural, one hand on the reins and the other pressed against his left side. "I'm all right," he said, before she could ask. His voice was even, too even. "You're not," she said. He got down from Dutch with the careful movements of someone managing pain rather than not feeling it, which was a different thing entirely. She came down the porch steps. Cold hit her immediately, sharp and immediate, and got to him before he'd finished tying the reins. "What happened?" "Trap wire snapped," he said. "Caught me in the side. It's not deep." "Let me see." "Elena." "Gideon." She used the same tone he used when he was being direct with her. "Let me see." He looked at her for a moment. Then he untucked his shirt. It was not as bad as she'd feared, which meant it was still bad enough. A gash along the left side, below the ribs, deep enough to have bled seriously through the cold of the afternoon. It had slowed. The cold had helped with that. But the area around it was angry in a way that suggested pressure, and the wound itself needed cleaning and closing. "Inside," she said. "Dutch needs—" "I'll do Dutch. Inside first." He went inside. She dealt with Dutch quickly, unsaddled, watered, hay from the stack, with the brisk efficiency of someone who had learned the horse's preferences out of practical necessity and was currently not interested in his grievances about left-side approaches. Dutch apparently sensed the shift in available patience and cooperated without incident. Inside, she made Gideon sit at the table and brought the water to heat, and found the clean rags she'd been accumulating for exactly this category of problem. She'd known, somewhere in the practical part of her mind, that a winter in this environment would eventually produce a wound that needed attention. She hadn't let herself think about it specifically, but the preparation had been unconscious. She cleaned the gash with hot water and the piece of strong soap Gideon kept on the shelf above the wash basin. He didn't make noise about it, which would have been easier to deal with than the tight silence he maintained, a controlled quality that she recognized as something learned, The silence of a man who had handled pain alone long enough that making sound during it seemed beside the point. "This needs closing," she said. "There's a needle in the kit on the right shelf," he said, "and gut thread." She got both. She had never sutured a wound before in her life. She had watched it done once, years ago, when a farmhand had cut himself badly, and the nearest doctor was a full day's ride. The woman who'd done it had been methodical and fast, and had told the farmhand to look at the wall and keep looking. "Look at the wall," Elena said. He looked at the wall. She worked quickly. She made 5 stitches, which was not perfect. She could see the imprecision in them, the slight unevenness of spacing. But they were tight and they would hold, and when she was done, she dressed the wound with a compress and tied it off and stepped back and exhaled. "Done," she said. He turned back from the wall and looked down at the dressing. "Good work." "They're not even," she said. "Even enough," he said. The same thing he'd said to her after the stumble on the trapline. She wondered if he applied that standard to himself as consciously as he applied it to her. He was quiet for a moment, looking at his own side. Then he said, "I should have checked the wire before I set my weight on it. It was old. I knew it was old." "Why didn't you?" He was quiet again. "Distracted," he said. She waited. He didn't elaborate. She'd learned that sometimes with Gideon you waited and more came, and sometimes waiting just produced more silence, and the silence was the whole answer. This time more came. "I was thinking about something else," he said. "On the slope. I was thinking about—" He stopped. Started again. "I've been out on that slope alone for 4 winters. I know every line I set. I know which ones need replacing." He looked at his hands on the table. "I didn't used to get distracted on the slope." Elena sat down across from him. She understood what he was saying, or thought she did, that the presence of other people in his space had changed the quality of his attention in some way he hadn't fully accounted for. Whether he meant that as an accusation or an observation, she couldn't tell. "I'm sorry," she said. "Don't be sorry," he said, quickly enough that she knew he'd read her interpretation. "I didn't mean— It wasn't a complaint, Elena. I just—" He looked at the fire. "I'm not used to my mind being somewhere else when I'm working." "Where was it?" she asked. He didn't answer right away. The fire said things. Thomas made a small sound from the cot and resettled. "Here," Gideon said finally. "It was here." She didn't say anything to that. She wasn't sure there was anything to say, or that saying it would improve on the fact of it. She got up and checked Thomas and added wood to the fire and brought 2 cups of the weak chicory she'd made earlier and set one in front of Gideon without asking whether he wanted it. He drank it without comment. The past nearly killed them on a Tuesday. She didn't know it was a Tuesday. She'd long since abandoned the tracking of days by name. But she found out afterward, when things had resolved enough that small details could surface, and she always thought of it as the Tuesday after that with the specific precision of remembering exactly what an ordinary detail the name of a day could be against the scale of what had almost happened. They had been moving supplies from the upper cache, a storage structure Gideon had built into the rock face a 1/4 mile up the slope, where certain things kept better in the sustained cold than they did near the cabin's fire fluctuations. It was a straightforward task that became urgent when Gideon identified signs that an ice formation above the cache might be shifting in ways that suggested it wouldn't hold through a warming cycle, and they needed to get the most critical stores down before that happened. Elena had Thomas in the body rig. She had argued with Gideon about whether she should leave him in the cabin. They went back and forth on it twice, with Gideon saying the cache was too far in uncertain conditions, and Elena saying she wasn't leaving a 5-week-old alone in a cabin in a mountain winter with no one within earshot, and she won because the logic was better. They went up in the morning. The sky was the same hard blue it had been when Gideon took his trapline wound, and she had learned to distrust that particular blue. It looked like safety, but it was really just absence of clouds, which was not the same thing. The cache was where he'd said. Getting the supplies down was physical work, the kind that made her conscious of every muscle that had spent weeks rebuilding itself from the depletion of the birth and the storm, and those muscles cooperated but voiced opinions about it. She didn't mention the opinions. She moved the crates Gideon identified as priority and stacked them for carrying and didn't complain. They were on the trail back, each carrying as much as was practical. Gideon with the heavy crate of preserved meat and trade goods, Elena with the smaller case of medical supplies and seeds, when the sound started. She felt it before she heard it, which was how she'd come to understand certain big things happened. A vibration in the soles of her feet transmitted up through the packed snow and into her legs, a frequency that her body registered as wrong before her brain had processed it into language. She stopped walking. "Gideon," she said. He stopped. He'd have felt it too. She could see it in the way his head came up, the specific animal alertness of a man who had spent years reading the mountain's signals. Then the sound caught up with the feeling. High above them, something very large was deciding to move, and the decision was making a noise that started low and built rapidly into something that swallowed the air. "Left," Gideon said. Not a shout, controlled, but with an edge she hadn't heard from him before. "The rocks on the left, get between them, now." She moved. She didn't look up. She'd learned enough to know that looking up at the thing coming at you didn't help you, and it slowed you down. She moved toward the rock formation he'd indicated, a cluster of boulders that jutted out of the slope and created a partial overhang, and she got herself and Thomas behind the largest one and pressed them both against the stone. The avalanche came down the slope to their right. Not directly at them, they were far enough to the left that the main mass missed them, but close enough that the displaced air hit her like a physical blow, and the sound was enormous, the kind of sound that made her understand on a cellular level why the mountain didn't need to try to be frightening. It just was. The scale of it was beyond what a human nervous system was designed to accommodate. She had her arms around Thomas. He was crying, really crying, the first full-throated cry she'd heard from him, which some part of her registered with relief even in the middle of everything else. A baby who cried like that had air, had force, was there. The snow came past in a wall of white and noise, and then it was gone, and there was a ringing quiet. She stayed behind the rock. Her legs were doing something complicated and involuntary, and she let them do it, pressed into the stone, with Thomas crying against her chest. "Elena." Gideon's voice, close. "Here," she said. "We're here." He came around the boulder. He looked at her first and then at Thomas, and the expression on his face in that moment was not something she could describe cleanly. It was too many things at once, relief and something else, something that lived behind relief in the territory of what could have been. "You're okay," he said. It was not quite a question. "Yes," she said. "He's crying." "I hear him," Gideon said, and what she heard in his voice when he said it was not the neutral information-gathering tone she'd come to know. It was something rawer than that. Something that sounded, for just a moment, like the voice of a man who had not known how much it would matter, and now did. He crouched down and looked at Thomas, who was crying with genuine commitment now, his face red and his fists clenched against Elena's coat. Gideon put one finger against the baby's palm, the same way she'd seen him check his breathing the first night in the cabin. Careful, precise. A man measuring something important. Thomas's fist closed around the finger and kept crying. "Good grip," Gideon said. "Yes," Elena said. Her voice was not as steady as she wanted. He looked up at her. "We need to keep moving. That slide may have destabilized the slope above the trail." "I know," she said. "Can you move?" She checked herself honestly, the way she'd learned to do instead of the reflexive yes that had been her default before. Her legs were unsteady. Her hands were shaking slightly inside her gloves. Thomas was still crying and warm against her chest. "Yes," she said. "Give me 5 seconds." He gave her 5 seconds. Didn't count them out loud, didn't watch her with the careful monitoring of someone waiting for her to fail, just turned and checked the slope above them and gave her the 5 seconds to find her footing. "Okay," she said. They went. The trail back was not the trail they'd come up on. The slide had changed the landscape in the way of something that had been there for years and was now simply not. A portion of the slope reshaped entirely, the packed path gone under a field of debris that would have to be navigated around. Gideon found the way through with the deliberate patience of a man recalculating in real time, and she followed and trusted his read of the terrain because she'd learned that his read of the terrain was worth trusting. She slipped once on a section of ice the slide had revealed and caught herself, and kept going. Thomas cried for 10 minutes and then stopped abruptly, the way infants did. The crisis internally resolved, the next thing already happening. By the time they reached the cabin, he had gone back to his default state of watchful calm. Inside, Gideon set down the crate he'd been carrying and stood in the middle of the cabin and pressed both hands against the table and breathed. Just breathed. Not performing recovery, actually doing it. The deliberate process of a body coming down from a high state of alert. She recognized it because she was doing the same thing. She got Thomas out of the rig and checked him. All of him. Hands, feet, face, the back of his neck. He was cold at the extremities, but not alarmingly. His eyes were open and found her face the way they'd been doing for a week now. "He's okay," she said. Gideon didn't answer. She looked over at him. He was still at the table, hands flat on the surface, looking at nothing in particular. "Gideon, I should have read the signs above the cache better," he said. "I saw indicators 2 days ago. I decided we had more time." "We had enough time," she said. "We got out." "You got out," he said, "because you moved when I said and didn't stop to ask questions. If you had—" "I didn't," she said. "No," he said. "You didn't." He looked at his hands. "That's not something I could have counted on knowing about you 3 weeks ago." She understood what he was saying. I was not praising her exactly. He was acknowledging a fact about her that he had verified through direct observation, the kind of verification he apparently required before he trusted anything, including people, including his own sense of another person. "You moved fast, too," she said. "You were to the left before I processed the sound." "That's reflex," he said. "Reflex is mine. What you did—" He stopped. "What?" "That was a decision," he said. "Made fast. But still a decision. That's different." She thought about that. She had not experienced it as a decision. She had experienced it as Gideon saying left and her body going left, the way she went where the terrain required without deliberating. But she understood now what he was drawing a distinction between the reflex of trained survival versus the choice to trust someone else's judgment in the moment when every instinct was screaming and the trust had to be placed faster than thinking aloud. She had trusted him, without reservation. In the half-second between the sound and the movement, she had simply trusted him. She hadn't noticed herself doing it until now. Thomas had fallen asleep against her shoulder in the reliable way of a creature who found the post-crisis quiet comfortable. She sat down in her chair by the fire and looked at the pattern of the flames while the last of the adrenaline worked itself out of her system. "My hands are still shaking," she said. "Not as a complaint, just as a fact worth saying." "Mine too," Gideon said. He had sat down at the table, and he held one hand out and looked at it with the expression of a man receiving information about himself that was technically expected but still somehow novel. "They'll stop." "I know," she said. She watched the fire. He didn't move from the table. The space between them was full of what had almost happened and what hadn't, and that was a kind of thing that didn't need to be made into words to be real. The mountain held them in the declining afternoon, and the cabin held the fire, and the fire held back the cold, which was all fire had ever been asked to do, and which was, on balance, enough. Later, when Gideon had moved to deal with the evening tasks, horses, wood, the quiet logistics of a life built on daily maintenance, Elena spoke to the room without directing the words anywhere specific. "I trust you," she said. "I thought you should know that. Not because I have to, because I've decided to." The sounds of him moving stopped briefly, then started again. "I know," he said, and then, after a pause, "I trust you too." It was not a large thing, maybe. It was the size of a fact stated plainly between two people who had spent weeks learning that plainness was more durable than anything dressed up to look like more than it was. But it held the same weight as the beams above them. Simple, load-bearing, built to last the winter, and whatever came after. Winter changed after the avalanche. Not the weather. The weather stayed exactly as indifferent and relentless as it had been. But something inside the cabin shifted in the way that things shift after a close call. When two people have stood on the same edge and looked down together and come back and have to figure out what to do with having seen that. It wasn't dramatic. It didn't announce itself. It was more like the difference between knowing someone was in a room and actually feeling their presence in it. The same fact, differently weighted. Gideon started explaining things without being asked. Not everything, and not in any way that felt like he'd made a decision about it. More like the information just started coming out. The way water finds gaps in stone that had always been there, simply requiring enough pressure to reveal them. He told her why he'd built the cache where he had, and the reasoning behind the trap placement, and what the different cloud formations meant about what kind of weather was 2 days out versus 5. He showed her how to read the snow surface for what was underneath it, which had direct and obvious application to not putting a foot through ice that looked solid and wasn't. She absorbed all of it. She always had been the kind of person who learned through watching rather than through being taught directly, which was fortunate because Gideon was not a teacher. He was a demonstrator, a man who showed rather than explained, and you either caught what he was showing or you didn't. She caught it. Thomas turned 8 weeks old in the middle of the hardest cold snap the mountain had produced all winter, and Elena marked the occasion by making something that actually qualified as a cake with the sugar and dried fruit Gideon had in the back of his stores and the last of the white flour. It was dense and imperfect and slightly burned on the bottom where she'd misjudged the fire, and Gideon ate 2 pieces without being asked and said it was good. "It's burned on the bottom," she said. "Less burned than most things I've made myself," he said, and took a 3rd piece. Thomas watched from the cot with the focused attention of a person observing a social ritual they intended to understand eventually. His eyes had settled to a color, a particular gray-green that Elena noticed one morning and then didn't say anything about for 3 days because it seemed like the kind of thing that needed to be said right or not at all. She said it wrong anyway. "His eyes," she said one morning, when Gideon was at the table with his coffee and Thomas was in the corner of Elena's arm, looking up at nothing. "They've gone gray-green." Gideon looked over. He looked at Thomas and then, briefly, with the self-consciousness of a man who didn't want to be caught doing it, looked away. "Lots of babies start with blue," Elena said. "They change." "I know," he said. "I just noticed because—" She stopped. The because was obvious enough that finishing the sentence would have been worse than leaving it. The gray-green was the same gray-green as the eyes of the man sitting 8 feet across the cabin from her, and that was a fact about the world that sat quietly between them. After a moment, Gideon said, "He's got your jaw." Elena looked down at Thomas. She hadn't thought about it before. "You think so?" "The set of it," he said. "Stubborn." "My jaw is not stubborn." "It is," he said. "You do a thing with it when someone tells you something you don't intend to accept. Like this." He demonstrated. A slight forward set, a fractional lift of the chin, the expression of someone who had heard a position and was already building the counter-argument. She stared at him. "I don't do that." "You're doing it right now," he said, and went back to his coffee. She looked down at Thomas, who was in fact doing something similar with his own small jaw, and despite herself she started laughing, and Thomas blinked at the sound of it, and Gideon didn't laugh, but she could see him working to not. The cold snap lasted 9 days. 9 days where the temperature dropped to the kind of cold that made the air feel like a physical substance you were moving through rather than just the absence of warmth. The horses required extra checking, extra hay, extra attention to their water not freezing in the trough. The woodpile went down faster than Gideon had projected, which bothered him in the precise way of a man whose projections were generally right and who took their failure as information about something he'd missed. "I undercounted," he said, looking at the diminished stack one morning, "by roughly a third." "Because you've never had 2 adults and a fire running around the clock," Elena said. "I've had 2 people here before," he said. "One winter. A trapper I'd traveled with. He was injured. I brought him back. He stayed until the pass cleared." He paused. "I didn't run the fire like this." "The baby needs the heat," Elena said. "Thomas needs the cabin above a certain temperature or his chest." "I know," he said. "I'm not complaining about the fire. I'm saying I miscalculated and now we need more wood. Tell me where to cut." He turned and looked at her. "It's 9 below out there." "I know what temperature it is." "Elena, Gideon." She kept her voice level. "We need wood. I can use an axe. I've been doing it for 6 weeks, and in less extreme cold. Yes, but I know the technique. Tell me where to cut." He studied her. She had the stubborn jaw thing. She was fairly certain, but she left it where it was. "The deadfall on the south side," he said finally. "It's closer, and the wood's already seasoned. But you do 1 hour, and you come inside whether you're done or not. 2 hours. 1.5, he said, and you take Dutch." "To carry wood?" "And because he won't let you freeze," he said, with the flat certainty of a man who had more faith in his horse than in most people he'd met. "He's difficult, but he's not stupid. He'll start for home if it gets worse." She took Dutch. Dutch consented to be useful with a kind of grim professionalism that suggested he was helping despite his views on the matter rather than because of them. She cut wood for 1 hour and 40 minutes, and then Dutch began the slow sideways drift that Gideon had apparently described accurately enough, and she gave up and went home. She came in with wood enough for 2 days and ice crystals in her eyelashes, and Gideon handed her a cup of coffee without ceremony, and she drank it standing at the fire and felt the cold leave her in stages, the way it always did. The surface first, and then the deeper layers that took longer to find. Good, he said, looking at the wood she'd stacked. I could have done more time, she said. You did the right time, he said. That's not the same as less. She was beginning to understand that was a philosophy, not just a comment. The right amount of the right thing, assessed without ego. She was building the same calibration in herself, slowly, in the way that you build any useful skill, through enough iterations that the calculation became instinct. It was during the second week of February, when the cold snap had finally broken and the temperature had climbed back to merely uncomfortable rather than genuinely dangerous, that the question of Carl arrived. It didn't arrive as a conversation. It arrived as a sound, the sound of a rider, far off and high on the trail, a sound Gideon heard first because he always heard things first, and came to the door with the particular stillness of someone identifying what they were hearing before they reacted to it. Elena heard it a moment later, and felt something move through her that she couldn't name cleanly. Not dread, not hope, not guilt. Something that contained elements of all three without resolving into any one of them. Someone's on the pass trail, Gideon said. Can they get through? If they started early and they know the route, he was already reaching for his coat. I'll go up to the high point and see. I'm coming with you. He looked at Thomas, who was in the cot. He'll sleep, Elena said. He just ate. He'll sleep for 2 hours. Gideon assessed this. We're 20 minutes up and back, he said. Not more. They went up. The high point was a cleared shelf of rock that Gideon used as a weather observation spot, and from it you could see a long section of the upper trail where it came around the eastern flank of the mountain. Elena stood on the rock and looked and saw the rider. One rider. A horse she didn't recognize from this distance. She stood there for a long time looking, and the rider came further into view, and she watched the way he sat in the saddle and felt something settle in her that had been waiting to settle for weeks. It's not Carl, she said. Gideon looked at her. You're sure? The way he sits, she said. Carl rides with his shoulders forward. This man is straight. She kept watching. And that horse is too big. Carl always chose smaller horses. Gideon watched the rider for another moment. Trader, he said, or messenger. Someone who knows the mountain. They went back down. The rider arrived at the cabin an hour later, a weathered man in his 50s named Colton, who ran supplies between the mountain settlements and who knew Gideon by name and reputation, and who stopped at the sight of Elena with the calibrated surprise of a man who had expected fewer people. Didn't know you had company, Rourke, he said. I do now, Gideon said. Come in. Colton came in and told them what was happening on the other side of the mountain, over coffee and dried meat. The Alderman Company had made it to Farrow's Creek Station, where they'd been stranded since the storm. 6 weeks. 3 people had been lost, 1 elderly man to cold exposure the first night, 1 child to a fever, and 1 of the wagons to a fire caused by a brazier tipped in the night. Elena listened without changing her expression. Thomas was awake now in the cot, watching the ceiling with great concentration. A child, she said. Which child? Colton shook his head. Don't know the names. One of the smaller ones, I heard. A boy, I think. She breathed. Clara was not a small boy. Clara was a girl of 8 with her mother's stubborn jaw and her father's careful eyes, and Elena held that information like a handhold. There's a man with the group name of Voss, she said. Carl Voss. He has a daughter, Clara. Colton thought about it. Can't say for certain. There were a lot of them. Station wasn't built for it. Are they still there? At the station? We're as of 3 weeks back, Colton said. Pass opens late April, early May this year. The mountain's red. They'll wait it out. After Colton left, he was continuing on to the lower settlements and wouldn't be back through until after the thaw. Elena sat at the table and was very still for a while. Gideon moved around the cabin doing things and left her to it, which was what she needed. Thomas started making sounds that meant he wanted attention, and she went to him and picked him up and stood at the window with him, looking at the mountain. "There's a man with the company on the other side of this," she said. "My husband. My daughter." Gideon came and stood at the far end of the window, not beside her, at the end, giving her the space. "I know," he said. "I don't know what he's told her," Elena said. "About me. About what happened." She looked at Thomas. She saw it. Clara. She watched them drive away. She knows what he chose. Gideon didn't say anything. "She's 8, Elena said. "She's going to have been living with that for 6 weeks in a crowded station with cold and a fever going through and—" She stopped. "She's going to be so angry." "At you?" Gideon asked. "At everyone," Elena said. "That's how she is. When she's scared, she gets angry, and she holds on to it. She's like me in that way." She pressed her cheek against the top of Thomas's head. "She's going to need someone to be angry at, and I'm not going to be there." "She'll have you in the spring," Gideon said. "Yes," Elena said. They stood there for a while without talking, and the light through the window was the particular winter light that meant early afternoon, pale and without shadow. "What will you do?" Gideon asked. "When the pass opens." She had known the question was coming. She had been thinking around it for weeks, approaching it and backing off the way you approached a wound you needed to probe, but that you kept putting off because you weren't sure what you'd find. "I don't know yet," she said. "You can stay," he said. The words came out with the care of something that had been decided in advance, not impulsive, not casual, measured. "If you want, you and Thomas, you can stay." She turned and looked at him. He was looking at the mountain through the glass. His face had the neutral set she'd learned to read past, into the actual thing underneath it, which was a man who had spent years keeping his surface still, because what was underneath was something he'd learned to be careful with. "You live alone," she said. "I have been," he said. "That's not the same thing as a preference." She looked at him for a long moment. He was still watching the mountain. He was not going to make this easy for her, or for himself. He was going to say the thing and leave it there and let her do what she wanted with it. That was who he was. She understood that now in the way you understand things that have been demonstrated rather than stated. "Clara," she said. "Bring her," he said, the same tone. "If she'll come." She might not. She might want to go back east, back to her father's family. She might hate it up here, or hate— She stopped. "She might hate me," Gideon said evenly. "That's a real possibility." "She's 8, Elena said. "She doesn't know what she thinks yet about men who aren't her father." "That's fair." He turned from the window. "What do you think? Not about what she might want or what makes sense. What do you think?" She had been asked this question before in her life by various people, and had always answered sideways, talking about what was practical, what was responsible, what she owed to one situation or another. It was a habit she'd built so gradually she'd stopped noticing the building. "I think I don't want to leave," she said. The straightness of it surprised her. "I think this is the first place I've been where what I can do matters more than what I look like doing it. I think Thomas is going to grow up knowing how to read the sky and check trapwire and understand that the mountain doesn't owe him anything, and that those are things worth knowing." She paused. "I think you're the most honest person I've ever been in a room with, and I'm including myself in that comparison." Gideon was quiet for a moment. "That's a lot of thinking," he said. "You asked." "I did," he said. "I'm glad you told me." He didn't move toward her, and she didn't move toward him, and neither of them said anything more about it for the rest of that day, because the thing had been said, and it didn't need to be repeated or elaborated or built into something it wasn't yet. It was what it was. Two people who had told each other the truth and were going to live with it for a while before deciding what it meant. March came. The days got longer in the precise, measurable way that late winter days got longer. Not dramatically, just a few minutes at a time, but enough that by the middle of the month the light was staying until nearly 5, and there was something in it that was different from winter light, warmer at the edges, more interested. Thomas noticed it. He had started turning his head toward the window in the morning with the determined focus of someone who had information and was acting on it, and Elena would hold him up to the light and let him look. She had been rebuilding herself all winter in the way that you rebuild something that has been severely stressed, not to the original configuration, which had been built for the wrong conditions anyway, but to something that fit the life she was actually living. She had lost the reflexive apology of her own size and weight, the habit of making herself smaller in rooms, the flinch when she had to pass someone in a narrow space, the constant low-level awareness of how much space she was taking up. Up here, her size was information. Her weight was a physical fact that had practical implications. Gideon had never once looked at her as though the implications were problems to be managed. He had looked at her as though she was a person with a particular set of attributes, and attributes were just what people had, and what mattered was what you did with them. She did not become a different person over that winter. She became more of who she already was. That was harder, actually. Becoming more yourself required letting go of the edited version you'd spent years maintaining, the version with the softened edges and the preemptive apologies and the small daily concessions to the comfort of people who found you inconvenient. The edited version had been protective in its way, but protection and armor were the same thing, and armor was also weight. She set it down gradually, the way you set down something heavy, carefully, paying attention to your balance as it shifted. One morning in late March, Gideon was repairing a section of the porch roof that had sagged under the winter's accumulated weight. Elena was outside with Thomas bundled against her in the carrier, watching him work, when he misjudged a footing and the board he was standing on went sideways and he came down hard, catching himself on the porch rail with both hands, but landing with a grunt that she knew meant impact, not just surprise. She was up the steps before he'd straightened. "What did you hit?" "The rail," he said. "I'm fine." "You said that about the trapwire wound and you had a 3-inch gash," she said. "This is different." "Let me see." "Elena." His voice had an edge in it. Not anger, but the edge of a man who was embarrassed about a misstep in processing it, which was its own thing. She stood back, gave him the space, watched him flex his hand against the rail and wince before he controlled it. "Your wrist," she said. He looked at it, then at her. "It's fine," he said, with less conviction this time. "Come inside," she said. "Let me look at it." He came inside. She looked at his wrist, swollen already, tender to careful pressure, but moving through its full range after a moment, which was either good news or the kind of injury that didn't show fully until the next morning. She wrapped it in cloth with a pressure that was firm without being aggressive and told him to keep it elevated for the afternoon. He sat at the table with his wrist elevated against a crate and looked at the situation with the expression of a man who found forced stillness personally insulting. "You could read," she said. "I have things to do." "They'll wait a few hours," she said. "The porch isn't going anywhere." He looked at the shelf with the oilskin-wrapped books, then at his elevated wrist, then at Thomas, who was on the blanket on the floor conducting some kind of personal research project involving his own hands. "What were you reading last?" he asked. "The Natural History," she said. "I finished it. I was going to ask if there was something else." He looked at the shelf for a moment. "The journal on the right end," he said. "The green cover. That one's better." She got it and sat down across from him and started reading. The journal turned out to be from a woman who had traveled the mountain territories 20 years prior with a survey party, writing detailed observations with a precision and dry humor that reminded her, oddly, of Gideon himself. She read a passage aloud after a while, the one where the woman described an argument with the survey party leader about the correct elevation of a particular peak, which she had won by the simple method of climbing the peak herself and measuring it. Gideon smiled. Actually smiled. The full version, not the controlled quarter version she'd seen before. It changed his whole face. "You've read this," she said. "Twice," he said. "She's right about everything except the Western drainage system." "Let me guess," Elena said. "You checked." "Obviously," he said. She laughed and he laughed, and Thomas looked up from his hand research with great interest at the sound, and the afternoon went by in a way that she thought later she would remember specifically, not for anything that happened in it, but for its quality. The particular quality of a few hours in which nothing was required except to be where you were and let that be enough. April arrived, and with it the first serious signs of the thaw. It started at the edges. The drip of melt from the south-facing eave, the way the light hitting the cleared ground around the woodpile made the packed snow soft and dark by mid-afternoon. Small signs, but definitive. The mountain was doing what it did, and the pass would follow. Elena knew what that meant, She had known all along what that meant. But knowing a thing intellectually and feeling it arrive were different experiences, and she sat with the difference one morning while Gideon was out and Thomas was sleeping, and the drip from the eave made its small, steady sound. Clara was on the other side of the mountain. In 6 weeks, maybe 8, the pass would be crossable. She had been a mother to Clara for 8 years. She had also been a wife to Carl for 10, and a daughter to her own parents before that, and a member of a wagon company that had voted, collectively, to leave her in the snow. She had been all of these things and had understood herself through the lens of these things. What she was to other people, what she owed and was owed, the calculus of belonging that most people spent their lives running without examining. She was examining it now. Gideon came in mid-morning, stamping snow from his boots, and she was still at the table with the cold coffee she'd forgotten to drink. "The South Trail's opening," he said. "Another 2 weeks and it'll be passable on horseback." "I know," she said. He looked at her. He set down what he'd been carrying and came and sat across from her, not filling the silence with anything, just present in it. "Say it," she said, "whatever you're thinking." "I'm thinking you need to go see your daughter," he said, "and that's true regardless of everything else." "Yes," she said, "and that whatever you decide after that—" He stopped, tried again. "Whatever you decide, you should decide it without feeling like you owe me anything. You don't owe me anything, Elena. That's not why I want you here." She looked at him. "I know why you want me here," she said. He held her gaze. "Do you?" "Yes," she said. "And I know why I want to be here. Those aren't the same as owing." He was quiet for a moment. "No," he said, "they're not." Outside the mountain dripped its slow, inevitable melt into the afternoon, and April pressed forward the way April always did, with the patience of something that knew it would win eventually and therefore didn't hurry. The pass would open, the world on the other side would become accessible, and Elena Voss, who had been left in the snow to die with her newborn son and had instead built something entirely different in the mountain winter, would have to walk back toward the life she'd had and decide what parts of it she was still willing to carry. She looked at Thomas, sleeping in his cot with his small fists curled and his gray-green eyes closed and the set of his jaw already stubborn. She looked at Gideon, who was watching her with the steady attention of a man who had said what he needed to say and was prepared to wait as long as necessary for her to work through the rest of it. She picked up her cold coffee and drank it. 2 weeks, she said. "About that," he agreed. She nodded once, the same single nod she'd seen him use when filing information. The nod of a person receiving a fact and acknowledging it without making it more than it was. "All right," she said. "Then we have 2 weeks." The 2 weeks passed the way the whole winter had passed. Not quickly, not slowly, but with the particular density of time that fills itself with necessary things and leaves no gaps for dreading what's coming. Elena used them well. She reinforced the shelf brackets in the main room that had been pulling away from the wall since before she arrived, using the technique Gideon had shown her for working with aged timber that didn't want to hold new fasteners. She reorganized the medical supplies into a system that made more sense than what had been there, not criticizing what Gideon had built, which was functional, but building on it with the logic of someone who had spent a winter actually using the supplies in crisis conditions, and knew which things needed to be findable fast. She made a second carrier rig for Thomas, better than the first, having watched Gideon's original design long enough to understand where it was improvable. She also talked to Thomas. She did this regularly now, had been doing it for weeks, carrying on a running commentary about what she was doing and why, and what she thought about it. He was 3 months old and understood none of it in any linguistic sense, but he tracked her voice with absolute consistency and had begun making sounds in response that she chose to interpret as engaged participation. "We're going to go down the mountain," she told him one morning while she was folding the last of the winter's laundering, "and we're going to find your sister, who is 8 years old and is probably furious and has been waiting long enough." She smoothed a shirt and set it on the stack. "And then we're going to come back." That last part she said quietly, not because she was uncertain of it, but because she was still learning how to hold certainty without clutching it. Gideon heard her. She knew he heard her because the sound of him working on the far side of the cabin paused for a moment, in the way it paused when something had his full attention and then resumed. He didn't say anything. He didn't need to. The morning they left, Elena and Thomas, on Bram, with the pack horse Gideon insisted on sending loaded with provisions, that were far more than necessary for the 2-day ride down. Gideon came out to the porch. He had done the same things he always did in the morning: built up the fire, fed the horses, made coffee. He hadn't made a ceremony of the departure, and she hadn't asked him to. They had said what needed saying over the past 2 weeks in the practical way they'd learned to say things, in pieces, during other activities, without the pressure of eye contact making everything feel heavier than it already was. But he came out to the porch and stood there while she checked the packs and got Thomas settled in the carrier against her chest, and she turned and looked at him. He looked back. 2 days down, he said. Farrows Creek Station is straight on the main trail once you clear the lower pass. You can't miss it. I know, she said. You told me. I know I told you. She almost smiled. I'll be back in a week, she said. Maybe less, depending on how Clara is. He nodded, the single nod. She started to turn Bram toward the trail and then stopped. She looked at Gideon standing on the porch of the cabin he'd built with his own hands in the mountain he'd chosen to live on alone for years. And she thought about the night he'd found her sitting in the snow with a baby who was the wrong color, and the fact that he had not needed a reason beyond. She got up and started walking. Gideon, she said. Don't do anything that would put you in a situation where you need suturing and there's no one here to do it. His mouth moved. Not quite a smile, but the shape one made when it was trying not to. I'll consider that, he said. She turned Bram down the trail. She didn't look back. Not because it would have been painful, but because the cabin was going to be there when she returned, and the man on the porch was going to be there. And she had learned over the winter that you didn't need to look back at things that weren't leaving. The trail down was a different experience than the trail she'd arrived on, unconscious and half frozen in a freight wagon. She was conscious this time, upright and mobile, on a horse who moved through the mountain terrain with placid competence. She had time to see where she was. The mountain was stunning in the way that things were stunning when they were not immediately trying to kill you. The old growth pines still carrying their winter loads, the light coming through them in slants that picked up the ice crystals in the snow and made brief fires of them. The silence, which was not empty but full of the sounds of melt and bird and distant water running under ice that was starting to thin. She had almost died here. She carried Thomas against her chest and thought about that plainly, without drama. She had almost died on this mountain in a snowstorm, and instead she had lived an entire winter on it, and the winter had taken things from her and given her things, and had not asked her permission for either transaction. That was the deal. That was always the deal. With places and with people and with the circumstances you didn't choose and had to navigate anyway. Nobody asked you first. You just got what came and made what you could of it. Thomas fell asleep against her chest somewhere in the first hour and slept with the thoroughness of someone who had decided the situation was handled and he could stand down. She rode with one hand on the reins and one hand pressed warm against his back and felt him breathe. She reached the lower trail by late afternoon and made camp in the way Gideon had shown her. Not the way she would have camped 6 months ago, which would have been functional but inefficient, but the way that took 10 minutes instead of 30 and produced a shelter that would actually hold through a cold night. She built the fire with the right wood in the right configuration and ate what she'd brought and fed Thomas when he woke, and lay in the bedroll listening to the mountain's nighttime vocabulary, which she could mostly read now. It was strange, she thought, how you could become native to a place that had tried to kill you. Stranger still that it was the place that had felt most like itself, most like somewhere she was supposed to be, than anywhere she'd lived before. She reached Farrows Creek Station by early afternoon the next day. It was a larger establishment than she'd imagined from the name, a main building that served as trading post, way station, and rough accommodation, with several outbuildings and a corral large enough to have held the Alderman Company's animals through the winter. The signs of that long occupancy were still visible. The ground churned and packed from months of foot traffic. The woodpile near the main building depleted in a way that suggested heavy use, a rawness to the place of too many people in too little space for too long. She tied Bram at the post and went inside with Thomas. The room was low-ceilinged and smoky and smelled of the particular combination of unwashed people, rendered fat, and winter-long confinement that she recognized from every crowded space she'd ever been in. There were perhaps a dozen people still there. The main body of the Alderman Company had apparently pushed on ahead in the first days of the pass opening, following their original route. She was looking around the room, getting her bearings, when she heard Clara's voice. Not words, just her voice. The specific pitch and cadence of her daughter saying something to someone across the room. The voice she had last heard saying "Mama" in the few seconds before Carl lifted her back onto the wagon seat. That voice hit Elena somewhere behind the sternum with a force that was entirely disproportionate to its quietness. She turned. Clara was at a table in the far corner playing some kind of card game with an older woman Elena didn't know. She was thinner than Elena remembered. Not alarmingly, but visibly, the thinness of a child who had been on short rations and stress for weeks. She was also taller. 3 months of growing in those 8-year-old bones. Clara looked up. For a moment she went absolutely still, in the way Elena had seen children go still when they were confronted with something they'd been trying not to want too much, in case wanting it made the absence worse. Then she stood up from the table, slowly, with the careful control of a child who had been holding herself together through an act of will and wasn't entirely sure what happened to the holding if she let go. "Mama," she said. Not loudly, just the word. Elena went to her. She crouched down to Clara's level with Thomas still in the carrier. Awkward, but she needed to be at her daughter's height, needed Clara to not have to look up for this. And opened her arms, and Clara came into them and held on with the fierce, unambiguous grip of a child who had been frightened for a very long time and was now going to express that with her entire body. Elena held her. She put her face into Clara's hair and felt her daughter shake. Not crying, not quite, but everything that preceded crying when a person had been holding it back so long that the release required authorization. "I know," Elena said quietly. "I know." "I told him not to," Clara said, her voice muffled in Elena's coat. "I told Papa not to. I said we couldn't just—" She stopped, started again. "He said you'd be all right. He said someone would come." "Someone did," Elena said. Clara pulled back enough to look at her. Looked at her carefully, the way children looked at adults they were checking for damage. Then her eyes dropped to Thomas, who was awake and staring at Clara with the profound attention of a creature encountering something new and finding it significant. "That's Thomas," Elena said. Clara looked at her brother. Something moved across her face. Complicated, 8-year-old complicated, the kind of emotion that doesn't have a name because it requires adult words to describe, and children feel it before they have those words. She reached out one finger and touched Thomas's hand very carefully, and his fingers wrapped around it the way they'd wrapped around Gideon's finger on the night of the avalanche. Clara looked up. "He's real," she said. "Very," Elena said. "Papa said—" She stopped again. "Papa said it was too risky to wait. He said if we stayed, we'd all die." "I know what he said," Elena said. She kept her voice even. She would not make this harder for Clara than it already was by telling her what she actually thought about what her father had said. That was a conversation for some other time, some year when Clara was old enough to hold the complexity of it. He made the decision he thought he had to make. "It was wrong," Clara said flatly. "Yes," Elena said. "It was." Clara looked at her. Then she looked at Thomas again. "You didn't die." "No." "How?" "A man found us," Elena said. "A good man. He brought us to his cabin and we stayed the winter." Clara absorbed this. "Where is he?" "Back up the mountain," Elena said. "At his cabin." Clara was quiet for a moment, working through something. Elena let her work. This was the thing about Clara. She needed to process at her own speed, and interrupting the process only ever made it take longer. "Are we going back there?" Clara asked. "To the mountain?" Elena looked at her daughter. Looked at her careful eyes, Carl's eyes, in their precision, but something else in them now that hadn't been there 6 months ago, something forged by the winter, and the fear, and the holding on. "I am," Elena said. "I want to, but I need to know what you want. What are my choices?" "You can come with me," Elena said. "Back up the mountain. It's a real place, Clara. A cabin with a good fire and work to do, and someone who's honest and doesn't make promises he doesn't keep." She paused. "Or you can go with your father. He's continuing west, I think, to the valley settlements. You'd have a normal life there, a town, a school." "Papa left you in the snow," Clara said. "Yes." "I don't want to go with Papa," Clara said. The directness of it was startling. the kind of clarity that children sometimes had about things that adults spent years complicating. I want to go with you. Elena felt something loosen in her chest. All right, she said, then that's what we'll do. She found Carl an hour later. He was in the outbuilding that had been converted to additional sleeping quarters, sitting on a bedroll with his elbows on his knees. And when Elena walked in, he looked up with the expression of a man who had been expecting this and had not come up with anything satisfactory to say. She looked at him. He looked at her. Thomas was in the carrier. Carl's eyes went to the baby and stayed there for a moment. He's alive, Carl said. Yes, Elena said. I didn't think... He stopped. I thought when we sent back from the station... There was no way back for months, Elena said. The pass closed. I know, he said. I know that. I meant... He pressed his hands against his knees. I thought you'd both be dead by the time anyone could reach you. We weren't, she said. He looked at her. There was something in his face that might have been guilt, or might have been the exhaustion of a man who had spent a winter with a decision he'd made and couldn't unmake, running the numbers on it over and over in the way that Carl had always run numbers. She knew that face. She had lived with that face for 10 years. I had to make a call, he said. In that moment, the storm, the company... Carl, she said, not harshly, just stopping him. I'm not here to argue about the decision. I understand what you calculated and why. I'm here about Clara. He was quiet. She wants to come with me, Elena said. Back up the mountain, to the cabin where Thomas and I spent the winter. Carl looked up sharply. That's no place for a child. I disagree, Elena said. But she's yours as much as mine. I'm not going to take her without telling you. Who's at this cabin? He asked. A man named Gideon Rourke, she said. He runs a trap line. He found us in the storm. She held Carl's gaze. He's a good man. Better than good. Carl looked at her for a long moment. She could see him running the numbers again. The calculation of what he was being told against what it cost him to accept it, against what a man of his particular practical nature did with a situation that didn't have a clean solution. You're not coming west, he said. No. You're staying on that mountain. Yes. He was quiet for a long time. Outside the station, someone was shouting something about a horse. Thomas made a small sound against Elena's chest and resettled. Carl watched his son with the expression of a man who had made a choice and was now in the presence of what the choice had cost him, and the two things were not the same. Claire's a stubborn kid, he said finally. She is, Elena agreed. She gets it from you. So I've been told. He looked at the door, at the middle distance, at the hands on his knees. She was angry all winter, he said, every day. She wouldn't say much, she'd just look at me a certain way. He paused. I don't think she forgives me. Elena thought about saying something carefully measured, something that acknowledged his difficulty without absolving him. Instead, she said, Forgiveness takes time. She'll get there, but she needs to be where she wants to be first. Carl nodded. He looked at Thomas one more time, his son who had been born 9 days before a snowstorm and had been left in the snow and had survived a winter on a mountain with a stranger. Something in his face shifted, some internal accounting settling into a different column. Take good care of them, he said. Both of them. I always have, Elena said, and left. Clara was waiting outside with her single bag packed, which answered any remaining questions about how long she'd been planning this. They stayed one night at the station. That night, lying in the narrow bunk with Clara pressed against her side, and Thomas in the borrowed cradle at the foot, Elena looked at the smoke-stained ceiling and thought about what she was going back to. Not in the way of someone rehearsing doubts, but in the way of someone taking inventory, checking what they had against what they needed, the way you checked supplies before a journey. She had a son who had decided to stay in the world against considerable odds. She had a daughter who had spent a winter building a spine of steel through an experience no 8-year-old should have needed. She had a mountain she knew, now, in a way that had cost her something real and given her something she hadn't known she was missing. And she had a man who had told her she could stay in the most honest terms available to someone of his particular nature, and who would be at the cabin when she returned, doing what needed doing, which was the only way he knew how to be. It wasn't the life she'd planned. She had planned something ordinary. The wagon west, the valley settlement, the the life that looked like what a life was supposed to look like from the outside. She had planned small and careful in the way of someone who had been told, too many times and too early, that wanting more than small and careful was a kind of greed that her particular type of person wasn't entitled to. She was done planning small. The ride back up took most of 2 days. Clara rode behind Elena on Bram for the first part, and then, around midday, asked if she could ride the pack horse solo, and Elena said yes and watched her daughter put herself straight in the saddle with the specific determination of a child who had decided this was something she was going to be able to do. She was not immediately able to do it. The pack horse had opinions. There was a 20-minute negotiation that went poorly for Clara before she found the right combination of posture and pressure and will. And then the horse moved forward, and Clara's face did something Elena would carry for the rest of her life. The pure, uncomplicated expression of someone who has just discovered that a hard thing is actually possible. "You got him," Elena said. "He's very opinionated," Clara said, breathing hard. "Most capable things are," Elena said. Clara looked at her. Then she looked at the trail ahead and straightened her back and kept going. They reached the cabin in the late afternoon of the second day, when the light was going gold and long through the pines in the way that meant the mountain's winter was genuinely ending. Elena could smell the fire before she saw the cabin. The particular smoke of Gideon's woodpile, which she had learned to recognize the way you learned the smell of any place that had been yours long enough to be specific. Gideon was at the porch, not waiting. She didn't think he was the kind of man who waited in the visible way. He was fixing the section of roof he'd damaged when his footing went wrong, and he had apparently timed the repair for late afternoon. And if those two things were connected, he was never going to admit it. He looked up when they came out of the tree line. He looked at Elena first, then at Clara. Clara looked back at him with the assessing gaze of an 8-year-old who had developed, over a winter of necessity, an excellent instinct for whether a person was worth trusting. She looked at him for a long moment. He held the look without performance. Just let her look, the same way he let everything else be what it was. "You're Gideon Rourke," Clara said. "I am," he said. "You found my mother in the snow." "I did." Clara appeared to consider this as a complete answer. Then she looked at the cabin, at the porch, at the woodpile, at the horses in the corral, back at Gideon. "Do you have things to do?" she asked. He looked at her with an expression that was the closest thing to surprise she'd ever seen on his face. "Always," he said. "Can I help?" A pause. "Can you split wood?" "No," she said, "but I can learn." Gideon looked at Elena. Elena looked back at him with an expression that said she had no idea where this was going, and was interested to find out. Gideon looked back at Clara. "Come on then," he said, and climbed down from the porch. Elena watched her daughter follow Gideon to the woodpile, Thomas awake and curious against her chest. She stood there for a moment, just standing, with the cabin behind her and the mountain above her, and the particular late afternoon light of early spring making everything sharp and amber and present. This was the thing she hadn't expected to learn, not the wood splitting or the weather reading or the trap wire or the way to suture a gash with a needle and gut thread in a cold cabin. Those were skills, and skills could be taught and measured and verified. What she hadn't expected was what happened to you when you stopped surviving and started building something instead. Surviving was enough. She would not minimize that. She had survived a winter that should have killed her and hadn't, and survival mattered in the absolute way that things mattered when the alternative was being dead. She had learned to respect survival for what it was. Not a consolation prize, not the bottom rung of a ladder toward something better, but a real thing that required real effort and deserved to be acknowledged. But building was something else. Building required you to believe the structure would still be standing after you. It required the kind of investment that only made sense if you believed in some future in which the investment paid off. And believing in that future meant believing in yourself as a person who would be present for it, not as someone being done to, not as someone accommodating the plans of people who had decided her worth without consulting her, but as someone who had looked at the available raw materials and made something. She was making something. It was imperfect. Everything real was imperfect. The cabin walls were squared, but not perfectly so. And the man who had built them was difficult in the specific ways of people who had lived too long with only their own judgment for company, and the 8-year-old at the woodpile was going to have days when she was furious about the winter, and the abandonment and the strangeness of this life she'd been handed. Thomas was going to be a complicated person, because he had complicated people for parents, and that was usually how it went. None of that disqualified it. She had spent years believing that imperfection disqualified things, that a person with visible flaws didn't deserve the same consideration as a person who presented cleanly, that a life with rough edges was a lesser life than one that fit the expected shape. She had believed this about herself first, and then about everything she touched, and the believing of it had made her smaller than she was, had convinced her that the space she took up was the wrong kind of space. The mountain had fixed that. Not kindly. The mountain wasn't kind. It was simply massive and indifferent and honest in the way that things were honest when they couldn't be otherwise. It had shown her that weight was not the same as burden, that the things others called too much were sometimes exactly enough, that what looked like a flaw from the outside sometimes looked like a foundation from where you were standing. She walked to the porch. "He's showing her the grain," Gideon said without turning. He and Clara were at the woodpile, and he was explaining something about how the wood split, and Clara was listening with the focused attention Elena recognized as her daughter's default mode when she had decided something was worth knowing. "She'll be at it for hours," Elena said. "Good," he said. She looked at him. He was watching Clara with the careful attention he gave to things he was still assessing. But underneath the carefulness was something else, something that looked, on a man not given to demonstrating things, remarkably like satisfaction. "Thank you," she said. "For what?" "For being someone she can look at and decide to trust," Elena said. "She's careful about that. She doesn't give it easily." "Neither do you," he said. "No," she said. "Neither do I." They stood together on the porch while the afternoon went on doing what April afternoons did on this mountain, cycling through light and cool and the sound of melt and the birds that had started coming back in the past week. The horses in the corral moved around each other in their habitual social patterns. Thomas had fallen asleep in the carrier with his cheek against Elena's collarbone. "She's going to have opinions about the cabin," Elena said. "I expect so. She's going to want to change things." "Some things probably need changing," he said, with the equanimity of a man who had already made a fundamental peace with the fact that this situation was going to be different from anything he'd previously arranged. Elena looked at him. "You're not worried about it." "I'm worried about plenty," he said. "Not about that." She understood the distinction. The things Gideon worried about were things with real consequences. The trap wire, the ice formation, the food stores, the pass. He had filed Clara, apparently, in the category of things with real consequences too, which was probably the most accurate assessment of an 8-year-old Elena had ever encountered. "Gideon," she said. "Hmm? I'm not going to thank you again for the winter. I know you don't want thanks for it." "I don't need it," he agreed, "but I want to say—" She stopped, found the right words, the actual words, not the reaching for words that made everything literary and false. "I know who I am now. I didn't before. I had guesses, and most of them were wrong because they were built out of what other people told me. This winter—" She looked at Thomas, at Clara, at the mountain going gold in the late light. "I know now. That's not a small thing." Gideon was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "No, it's not." She let it be. Below them, at the woodpile, Clara had apparently decided she was ready to try, and Gideon had handed her the small axe and was positioning her grip with the patient precision of a man who understood that technique mattered more than effort, and that teaching someone properly the first time was worth more than correcting them 50 times after. Clara was listening. She was very serious about it, in the way she was serious about things she intended to master. The first swing missed. Not badly. It glanced off the side of the log and buried the axe head in the stump, and Clara pulled it out and looked at it, and did not appear to consider this a reason to stop. The second swing split the log clean. Clara looked at the two pieces. Then she looked up at Gideon. He gave her the single nod, the nod Elena had come to understand as his highest available denomination of acknowledgement. Clara turned and looked at Elena on the porch, and her face did the thing it had done on the horse, that pure, uncomplicated expression. Elena raised a hand, a small wave, nothing dramatic. Clara turned back to the woodpile and reached for the next log. The summer came, then a second winter. then a spring that brought a trader named Colton, who told them that Carl Voss had made it to the valley settlements and had built something modest and functional in the way that Carl did everything, and that the Alderman Company had disbanded as such companies did, its members going their separate ways into the ordinary lives they'd been heading toward all along. Elena heard this and filed it, the way you filed things that mattered but didn't change your coordinates. Gideon expanded the cabin the second summer. Not dramatically, not with any declaration of intent. Just one morning he looked at the east wall and said, "We need another room," with the tone of a man who had done the calculations and arrived at a conclusion, and Elena said yes with the same tone, and they built it together over 6 weeks, with Clara doing tasks appropriate to 8 turning 9-year-olds, and Thomas watching from the blanket on the ground with the serious attention of someone intending to do this himself someday. Travelers started finding them. Not many. The mountain wasn't on any main route and never would be. But occasionally someone would come through the pass and know, from Colton, or from someone Colton had told, that there was a cabin at the high camp where you could stop and be fed and not turned away. Gideon said nothing about this. Elena made food for the travelers who came, and Gideon made room in the outbuilding, and neither of them discussed it as policy because it wasn't policy, it was just what they did. Clara grew. Thomas grew. The seasons did what they'd always done and were not impressed by any of it. There was a morning in the third spring when Elena was carrying water from the creek, a task she'd done hundreds of times now, so routine that her body did it while her mind was elsewhere. And she stopped on the path and stood there for a moment without particular reason. The mountain was doing its spring thing, the melt running in every channel it could find, the pines releasing whatever they'd been holding in tight all winter. The air had that quality it only had a few weeks out of the year, clean and cold and carrying the smell of things beginning again. She thought about the woman who had sat in the snow with her back against a wagon wheel, waiting, who had gotten up and walked into the trees because she refused to be found in the place where they'd left her, who had opened her mouth and made a sound that might not have carried far enough but had. She thought about what that woman had known and not known. Had known that she wasn't going to accept the verdict, hadn't known what she was walking toward, or whether there was anything to walk toward, or whether getting up was anything more than the last pride-back gesture of someone who had run out of everything else. It had been enough. The getting up had been enough. That was the thing she'd carry, she thought, not the winter, not the avalanche, not the moment the wagon passed her without slowing. Those were events. What she'd carry was the understanding that the space between dying and living was sometimes nothing more than the decision to move, made without certainty, made without guarantee, made because the alternative was to let someone else's verdict about your worth be the last word. She had not let it be the last word. She picked up the water and went home. Gideon was at the table when she came in, with Thomas on his knee, showing him something in the natural history book. The one Elena had read first that winter, now read by everyone, including Thomas, who couldn't yet read but who treated the illustrations as serious documentary evidence of a world he intended to investigate. Clara was outside doing something productive that involved hammering, which was her default mode of self-expression when she was working something out internally and needed the noise. Gideon looked up when Elena came in. He did the thing he'd been doing for 3 years now, the thing she didn't think he was aware of. The quick visual assessment, the confirmation that she was here and complete and as expected, and then the return to what he'd been doing. It was the same check he gave the horses and the traps and the weather, and she had understood for a long time now that this was what it looked like when Gideon Rourke cared about something. He checked on it, quietly, regularly, without announcement. "Colton's coming through next week," he said. He asked if we needed anything brought up. "Flour," she said, "and Clara wants more of those specific nails for whatever she's building." "I'll send him the list," he said. Thomas looked up at Elena with the gray-green eyes that had stayed, that had always been going to stay, and reached for her in the way of a child who knew she was going to reach back. She did. Outside the cabin, the mountain went on being what it had always been, enormous and indifferent and honest, not offering anything except exactly what you were willing to work for, not promising anything except that the work would cost what it cost, and the outcome would be what it was. No softening, no accommodation, no reassurance. She didn't need reassurance. She knew what she'd built here. She knew what it had cost and what it had given back, and she knew, without needing to compare it to any other life, that it was hers in the way that only things were yours when you'd made them rather than inherited them. This cabin, this mountain, This man at the table with her son on his knee. This daughter outside building something with the specific intensity of a person who intended to leave her mark on the available material. This was what remained when you stripped away what other people had decided you were, and sat with what was actually there. It was imperfect. It was complicated. It was enough. It was, she had decided, exactly enough.